Welcome to The Making of. I'm your host, Jack Petz. The show is all about the people behind the businesses we don't always hear about, especially founder led, family run, and service based companies that quietly keep things running. In each episode, I talk with owners and entrepreneurs about how they built their businesses, the decisions they made along the way, and what came next. Today is our first episode, and I'm really glad to kick things off with a conversation that checks all those boxes. Our guest today is Gary Dennis. Before we get into the interview, I want to give you a quick overview of Gary's background so that you have the full picture of what he has built and the experience he is bringing to the conversation. Today, we're looking at the career of Gary Dennis, the co founder, chairman, and former CEO of Mammoth Holdings, a major operator focused car wash platform he helped launch in 2002. Over more than 2 decades, the company has grown into a multi state platform and as of October 2025, operates more than 150 car wash facilities across 18 states with a workforce of over 1,500 employees. Its expansion has followed a buy and build strategy, combining acquisitions with new development. During Gary's tenure as CEO, the platform completed more than 32 acquisitions, added over 100 locations, and developed more than 40 sites, supported by investors including the Pritzker Organization and Red Dog Equity, who partnered with the company following an equity raise in 2018. Before starting the business, Gary spent about 12 years in investment banking doing equity research, working across several firms and ultimately working alongside Richard Chip Hackett, who later became his co-founder. His career reflects a major shift from finance to entrepreneurship. Gary served for CEO for nearly 20 years before retiring from the role in 2022. He now serves as chairman, a board member, head of the business advisory council, and represents the company externally at industry events. In addition to his work with the company, Gary serves as board chair of Nurture Capital Partners, is an advisory board member at Georgia Tech's College of Business, and previously served as president for the International Car Wash Association. He also funded the J. Gary Dennis Fund for Entrepreneurship at Vanderbilt University and helped initiate seed funding for an entrepreneurship program at Georgia Tech. He is based in Atlanta, Georgia. It is my honor to introduce to everyone Gary. Awesome. Gary, thanks for doing this with me. I gave the audience a high level overview of your background, but I'd love to start a little more personally. Kind of when you think back to your early years, what were some things that shaped you, how you kind of thought about work and business, and kind of just your overall, upbringing would be super helpful for the audience.
Yeah, Jack, thanks for having me and happy to talk about some of these things. I grew up in an environment, both of my parents, my dad was a maintenance mechanic at a manufacturing facility, and my mom was a secretary for a state agency. And so I grew up a very kind of humble beginning or profile. I mean, we were, I would say, middle class at best, but my parents had a tremendous work ethic, and even though neither one of them had gone to college, they were insistent that that I seek out a path to go to college. And somehow, they managed to get all the bills paid and take care of us. And but I think coming from those humble backgrounds and meager backgrounds really kind of, it helped me kind of relate to what I would call the typical average person out there. And so I think as I look back on it, it really kind of helped, I think, shape my ability to lead people or talk with people. One thing that people would come up to me, they're like, "You're so approachable." And I would laugh because, once you have some level of success or you've gone to a certain school and you have that behind your name, all of a sudden people start ascribing to you a life that is not necessarily accurate. It's what their perception is, that you must have always been successful or came from a very well-to-do background, when the reality was just the opposite. But I think being able to kind of straddle the fence, so to speak, in terms of being able to have academic and intellectual conversations with people, but then also just being able to sit with people at, a very modest restaurant and have a conversation, or in the work environment, talk to people. It kind of opened up a skill set that I really didn't appreciate at the time. I think the other thing, I look back, I had a great childhood. Again, we were not blessed with a lot of money, but I had I still have two wonderful parents. Thank goodness they're still with me. I look back and it really formed me in ways I really didn't appreciate till much later in life.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's super interesting. And, growing up with a dad who was a mechanic, a mom was a secretary, and what ultimately ended up, I saw you went to, Georgia Tech for college, studied industrial management. Did you grow up in the Atlanta area? I obviously probably should.
I grew up in Macon, Georgia,
Okay.
just south of there. My parents didn't know anything about the college process. I remember going with a buddy of mine on a school visit to Georgia Tech. My parents didn't know anything about guiding me to the application process or how to go visit schools. The only thing they told me is I couldn't go to the University of Georgia because they thought I would party too much. And so their suggestions was they would approve either Georgia Tech or Auburn, which were kind of two close by schools that they obviously knew about reputationally and things like that. It was kind of foreordained that I stay in the South and go to someplace close by.
Yeah, definitely. Nice and close to home so parents can visit you on the weekends. You can get
Yeah.
your laundry done if you need to. So I guess like, what kind of led you to studying industrial management? Did you like, ever picture yourself, hey, I want to be an entrepreneur? Your dad was a mechanic, mom was a secretary, like, going to college, kind of how did you think about it?
Well, I think a lot of our conversation today, Jack, is going to be geared toward things that I did to screw things up or did not anticipate at the time. So if anybody is listening to this, hopefully they'll pick up a lot of, hey, you can still make a lot of mistakes and things can turn out okay. But I went to Tech, started out as an electrical engineer. I went to a very small high school. I think we had 44 in my graduating class, and there were 220 people in my freshman calculus class at Tech. And I was so overwhelmed with all of that. I was too busy kind of watching people and trying to figure out their story. And even though I'd taken calculus in high school, I think we got through most of that within the first week of at Tech. And so I quickly got thrown to the wolves. And ultimately, when I graduated Tech, I graduated with, I don't know, a 3.2 grade point average. But the important part of that is when you start with a 1.7 grade point average, you actually have to do pretty well in subsequent quarters to actually make up for the hole you dug. That's a long answer to your story, but after the first quarter, it was a kind of a mutual decision between Georgia Tech and myself that engineering was probably not the best path for me. And that kind of threw me into the management track, so to speak, which is kind of a running joke at Georgia Tech. They're the engineers, and then they even laugh at the industrial engineers, and so much more so at the industrial management side. But I was still always a numbers guy. I wasn't always a really deep mathematician at heart, but I love numbers, so to speak. So along that path, I really kind of fell in love with finance. And that was, it wasn't differential equations that got me excited, but it was the math associated with finance and understanding modeling and things like that.
Definitely. That's super helpful overview there. And I guess, in throughout college, did you get to have any internship experiences where you're like, hey, I want to do this management side of things, don't exactly know how that works. Did you get any exposure to internships and like, hey, I want to do this, didn't want to do that? Because, I feel like so many people nowadays just really struggle with, I'm here, I need to do that, or I'm an engineer, I need to do this kind of these, conformed identities, like you said, where you're this, you're that, but,
Yeah.
is that your true passion? Maybe, maybe not.
Well, the long and short of it for me was because my parents, were not financially wealthy. I needed to kind of work to get through school. And so Tech has a very robust co-op program. It's mostly geared around the engineers, and a lot of kids would be electrical engineers and they go work for Georgia Power, and it's a program where we were on the quarter system then, but either that or semester you go and work every other semester, every other quarter. And I wanted to go back to Macon so I could live at home and save money. And being in industrial management, there wasn't a lot of co-op opportunity. So I actually created one. I approached a hospital company and actually started in their computer science department. And so back in those days, they were running a big IBM mainframe and they were running COBOL programming language. I wasn't that good. I wasn't a good programmer at all, but I wanted to get a job. And I actually, I had to take the night shift a lot. I'd be on call. I had to learn how to do COBOL programming. So I actually became somewhat good at it. But along the way, again, I kind of really wanted to be in the finance side of things. So I used that entree as a co-op student to eventually talk to the treasurer of that company. And he took me on in the finance area of the business. So probably spent 2 or 3 quarters working in the computer science area and then the balance of that in the financial department.
Awesome. And how did you kind of get him to, hey, someone on the coding team, take me onto the treasury, the corporate finance side of things?
You,
How
you
did you
know,
do that?
I just, I walked by his office one day and knocked on the door. And back in those days, everything, he had these big, big handwritten spreadsheets, because Excel on computers was just being invented. It really didn't exist. So he was doing everything by hand. And I said, hey, I'm hardworking. This is what I want to do. I think I could be of help. I want to learn. Will you take me under your wing and let me come on board?
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. And you're kind of after that, it was off to the races. How long were you working there for? A couple quarters?
Yeah, yeah. By the time I got done in my co-op program, I had worked a full 2 years, and it was the best experience ever. It was really a good wake-up call. I remember at one point he called me in his office and he asked me an accounting question. It was cost accounting, and I didn't know the answer. And he looked at me. He said, I thought you told me you took cost accounting. I said, well, I did. I made an A. And he looked at me. He said, do you think I care what kind of grades you made in it? He's like, you don't understand the material. You have no idea. So you're totally useless right now. And it was, getting that wake up call as a sophomore instead of after you graduate from college and get out there. It just totally changed my mindset on not only, it wasn't about making good grades all of a sudden, it was actually about learning the material and asking the right questions. And this guy was one of the smartest guys I ever knew. He went to a really small school in Georgia that most people would just, kind of roll their eyes at in academia, but one of the brightest guys I've ever met. And I'll never forget the experience I got from doing that.
Awesome. And such a cool story too. He kind of just he walked into his office, he took a chance on you. Who knows if we would be having this conversation, if he was like, "Hey, get lost, Gary. I got better things to do." So that's
Yeah, good point.
super interesting. And you were working there doing corporate finance, and then you went on to end up doing your MBA at Vanderbilt right after graduating from Georgia Tech for your undergrad. Can you kind of walk us through, what you're thinking about, why you kind of did that? I know most people tend to, do, MBA a couple years down the line, 2+2, super popular. So what was your kind of rationale on that?
Yeah, at the time, I was pretty ambitious in terms of wanting to work on Wall Street. And I knew I wanted to be a finance major. I wanted to go get an MBA. And I kind of felt like the years that I had in co-oping, while maybe not exactly the same as, post-graduation work for a couple years, was pretty close. And it was that experience I just told you about that I actually learned a lot of the material after I got that wake up call. I felt like I kind of knew which way was up and applied to a lot of grad schools. Some of them were just adamant that no, you had to have the 2 years work experience. Vanderbilt was one. I think I also got into Pepperdine, and I had a great professor at Georgia Tech. Unfortunately, just died a couple years ago, but it was everybody's favorite. Everybody hated him until they took his classes and they ended up loving him. But just a wonderful human being. And I remember, going to him and seeking guidance and all. And he basically said, go to the best school you can get into. And if you're going to be kind of a Southeastern type person, there's no better place to be than Vanderbilt from a reputation standpoint. And remember, this was 35 years ago. So, don't think of it in terms of how Vanderbilt is known today or so. But, 35 years ago, Vanderbilt did have a good national reputation, but especially in the Southeast. So that was kind of my thinking. They'll let me in and people recognize them and know who they are. So let's roll the dice to see what happens.
That's super exciting. How was kind of just the experience at the MBA program, being that you are, 22, maybe 23, your peers are, 27, 28, maybe 30 even. Like, did you feel like, hey, I mean, I know you had about 2 years of working experience, just like a chip on your shoulder, like hey, he's just a kid, like I don't know if you ever felt that at all.
Well, I think because Vanderbilt uh, was willing to take people straight out of undergrad, the age skewed a little bit younger. I mean, certainly there were some, 28, 30 plus year olds in the class, but there were some that were right out of undergrad. So it never really felt awkward at all from an age standpoint.
Hmm.
And, in getting into grad school, it's interesting. You look back and, for people who came, I mean, I had a roommate that was a history major in school. He knew nothing about business, nothing about accounting, no finance classes. So, it was a really steep learning curve for him. A lot of, engineers and all who very, very bright people, but don't have those disciplines. So, I felt like tech really prepared me well. It wasn't like plowing a lot of new ground because I think I was pretty well steeped in some of the basics. I laugh now, I go back based on what I ended up doing and some of the issues that I used to face and all, wondering why I didn't take more HR related classes or maybe some operations classes. I was kind of a finance major in MBA school and did a lot of that. But all in all, it was a great experience, and it was just kind of a natural escalation from what I'd already been doing at Tech. So it wasn't like a brand new world, and I was really struggling because I'd never heard of some of these concepts before.
Totally understand that. And super awesome opportunity. And right after your MBA, you started working in investment banking at JC Bradford and Co. in Nashville. And you kind of mentioned this a couple times, always been interested in finance. Just would love to hear kind of where, you got that interest. Obviously, investment banking, private equities, kind of the new hot spot for, under college undergraduates, but would love to hear kind of like what you found interesting about it. Obviously, you did equity research for about 12 years. So yeah, would love kind of your overview there.
Yeah, just in general, I love the idea of, I really didn't want to be in the sales and trading function in terms of capital markets work. I really wanted to do investment banking. At the time, there really wasn't an open position, but I got recruited for equity research, which, I was 22 years old. I really didn't know a whole lot about it. And then I look back and say, wow, I can't believe they hired a 22-year-old right out of grad school to be an equity analyst trying to tell people how to run their businesses or, recommend stocks to people when I, barely knew which way was up. Basically they hired me and one other guy. It was supposed to be an apprentice program. That lasted, I don't know, 3 months or so. And then I got promoted to, full analyst, which again, at the time I thought was really cool. Now I look back on it and just shake my head laughing. And it's really funny when you now turn on CNBC and you see guys that I used to call on back in the days that are now, extremely wealthy, very successful money managers, but they were, 35 years ago, I was calling on them, and boy, I got some really good wake up calls from them as well. There's nothing more humbling than walking into a money manager who's really, really good and you're green and right out of school, and you better be careful with your ego because you're going to get a reality check very, very quickly of how your analysis is lacking in a lot of different ways.
That's awesome. Any good stories in particular where, you just got ripped apart, or you just like really good for your kind of overall learning
There's so
longevity?
many. I can remember specifically, and I see it because I see them. They make guest appearances on CNBC. Even one is a big Tesla fan, and recently, I think just in the last week or so, did a big town hall with Elon Musk about his investments. But I guess whatever my thesis was, and a lot of times I think I was directionally correct, but I just lacked the true understanding, the depth, and they would just ask me question after question after question. And it's pretty humbling when after 20 minutes or so, that you've just been eaten alive and you still got another 20 minutes left in this in this meeting, but it made me way better. Again, these are the life lessons of being humbled, being called out, being exposed makes you either decide that that's not what you want to do, or you're like, I gotta start working harder and getting smarter. And I see that I got a long way to go.
Yeah, definitely. So like you were at Br- Bradford for, 11 years. Kind of like what was your plan? Like great paycheck, worked a lot, obviously. Easily could have just rode off into the sunset. Like what was kind of your thought process there?
Well, I think a couple things. One was working for a regional firm. This was back in the days when Glass-Steagall was still a thing, and so there was a separation between commercial banks and investment banks. I really didn't want to live in New York and work on Wall Street. I mean, I'd travel there multiple times a year, and we had clients there and everything else. But I kind of liked the lifestyle of living in Nashville. And we were a partnership, and it was a lot of fun. I mean, the culture of that firm was just unbelievable. And it actually, this is something I used later on in life. Um, about forming partnerships, what a good partnership looks like. It's not that everybody was best friends, but I mean, we were a very successful firm. We did a lot of, basically, I'd call us an IPO shop from an equity standpoint. We were not huge in M&A, but we took a lot of companies public, though. And we were just, I think at the time, I think we had 600 or 700 partners and, 4 or 5 times that many employees or whatever,
Hmm.
and life was good. And I really enjoyed it. But soon, toward the end of it, I guess around 2000 or so, when Glass-Steagall kind of those walls fell down, the commercial bank started coming in, buying up regional firms. It became pretty clear that Bradford needed to sell. It was best course of action. And so I kind of saw the handwriting on the wall of how that was going to end. And then I stayed in the business a little bit longer, but it was not the same culture. It was not nearly as much fun. I started working for a commercial bank in their
Hmm.
capital markets effort. I said, there's got to be more than life than, trying to drink the Kool-Aid of the commercial bank and what they're trying to get you to do. And all of a sudden they want you to sell insurance products and credit card transactions. I'm just like, this is, and instead of, we were very entrepreneurial at JC Bradford. Kind of like if you saw an opportunity, you go take it. And then all of a
Hmm.
sudden you're working for a bank, corporate bank, and it was very bureaucratic. And that just reinforced I was never consciously wanting to be an entrepreneur, but I knew that I'm a skeptic by nature,
Hmm.
more so after being an analyst. That was really a skill set that I learned.
Yeah.
I was very trusting of people until I became an analyst and learned some hard lessons about what people tell you, companies tell you about their prospects and finances. But anyway, I learned to be skeptical.
Yeah.
And then I just don't have the patience for the bureaucracy of a corporate environment. And some people eat that up and they're really good at it and they can do that. But, endless meetings and saying the right thing or having to jump through certain hoops, I'm like, that's just not my style.
Definitely. That's super helpful there and great for the audience because a lot of people might be similar to my age, just graduated, trying to figure out exactly what they want. So, great to hear from someone like yourself, who actually made that switch, even, it was 11, 12 years down the line, but you still did it. So super cool. And would love to hear kind of another on the flip side, like what did, equity research, investment banking not prepare you for once, you were running an operating company? Like,
Well,
yeah.
I think, investment banking, equity research was really good at being able to see a lot of different companies.
Hmm.
And even though probably early on I wasn't thinking about it consciously, but subconsciously, you start seeing, what makes for a good management team, what makes for a good business model, and you get to see a lot of different things. And I think that's the good news. The bad news of doing it is I think you get into a rut or at least a mindset to say, well, gosh, I've been doing this for 12 or 15 years. This is what I know how to do. So this must be maybe I'm at a different firm or I'm doing it slightly different. But like you I told you earlier, it was like I was always finance, finance, finance.
For
And
sure.
so after 15 years or so, you look at it, you're like, okay, I'm a finance guy. And you kind of pigeonhole yourself. And I think you say, I don't know that I know how to do anything else. So it's kind of a blessing and a curse. Blessing that you get to see a lot of different businesses, you learn, but then you can get caught up, you get well compensated, you kind of get comfortable, and then you doubt your ability to do other things because you just never had a chance to do them.
Definitely. I feel like that's a very big topic nowadays. The golden handcuffs, as everyone kind of knows, where you're making good money, you have a nice apartment, nice lifestyle, like taking that extra step is, very scary, and would love to hear kind of like the conversations you and Chip were having. I know you guys worked together beforehand in investment banking, leading up to launching Mammoth in 2002.
Yeah, well, it's and I actually had a third partner initially, and I'll talk about him in a second here. But my partner Chip was also with me in investment banking, and we saw the handwriting on the wall. Actually, we started working together the day before September the 11th. So we were scheduled to fly to New York on September the 11th that afternoon. Obviously, that trip never took place. But, about a year in, we are like, this is a whole lot of fun. And, but what else can we do? And Chip said, well, I always wanted to own my own business. And his dad was an entrepreneur. And I said, well, okay. I said, what do you know about running a business? And he said, well, not a lot because I've never have. And I said, well, okay, we're in the same boat because I've never run anything either. I've told people how to run their business, which is a joke, but now what are we going to do? So, we both had small children at the time, so we weren't prepared to just chuck it all and just figure out what we're going to do. We're like, hey, let's be thoughtful about this, and maybe let's research if there are some passive investments that we might be able to do as kind of a sideline, right? So we're going to create a side hustle while we keep doing what we've been doing. And so we researched a lot of different businesses. We looked for specific attributes of some of these businesses. And somewhere along that journey, we found the car wash business. But in those days, it was very different than what it looks like now. There were basically two different models back then on extreme ends of the spectrum. One was the full serve car wash, which maybe employed 40 or 50 people. Really, really tough business to manage. We had zero interest in that. And then on the other end was the self serve car wash, which really didn't take even one FTE. You could build it, hire somebody to come by once a day for an hour or two, make sure the place is cleaned up. You'd go once a week and collect the money and check on things, so to speak. So we're like, it's a pretty interesting business model. Single wash, you're not going to retire off of it. But I said, if we build this, learn the business, I could foresee that we, get up to a dozen of these things, and they're throwing off, a couple $100,000 of cash flow or so. And, worse things in life than to have a side hustle that's bringing in, a couple $1,000,000 a year in EBITDA. So that was kind of our initial plan. And we didn't really think through anything other than, hey, let's just take a chance. Let's start this. Let's build one. It was, I think at the time the project was like $1,000,001 or something. So we put our funds together, and the third partner that joined us then, we subsequently bought him out. But at the time, I was worried about leaving and starting a business or, all of this. And in and we've been friends since childhood. So we would have direct conversations, but he tends to just say things very direct. And sometimes, they come across as rather simplistic, but, I was wringing my hands and worried about, how do I start a business? Do I know what to do? And can I make these decisions? And he looked at it, he said, well, they must be profitable because people keep building them. So it can't really be that hard, can it? And I think you can probably figure it out.
Yeah.
So, it just took, like I said, you get so myopic sometimes once you get embedded and enmeshed in your chosen profession, you discount your ability to do other things. And sometimes it just takes somebody looking at them like, look, people do it all the time. Are you telling me that you're not smart enough to figure it out? Just go make it happen. So anyway, that was kind of the the kick that I needed to actually have the confidence to go out. And we didn't at first. Like I said, we were going to do this on the side. And it wasn't until a little bit later when we saw a revision, a new version of this concept, that we decided to jump in full time and walk away from the investment banking business.
Awesome. And like walking in full time into the business, like kind of how was that process? Obviously, like you said, very comfortable, a nice lifestyle. Like, were you worried? Hey, I might fail. I have kids, I have a family to support. Like, did you have those conversations with Chip and the other partner?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. That was really tough. But soon after we built our first project, the self-serve, the guy who sold us the equipment called us. He said, "Hey, would you go? Would you be interested in going to Louisiana and looking at a concept that a guy has come up with?" And we're like, "Sure," because I mean, that's we were already in the business, so we were curious as to what other people were doing. So we went and we saw that a guy had I told you there was the full serve side and the self serve side, and they were diametrically opposite. This guy had basically borrowed some ideas that he had seen in Europe. He worked with a technology POS company here in the US, and he built a model that we just walked away and said, wow, this is a better mousetrap. It was very clear. In essence, by putting in technology, he was able to reduce labor dramatically. So all of a sudden it became very manageable. And because he was able to reduce labor, you could actually charge a much lower price. So once you saw it, and it's now called the exterior express concept, where you stay in your car, you ride through, and you kind of vacuum on the back end yourself. And typically you have 2 or 3 pay stations up front that take away some of the labor. Once we saw that, we're like, okay, that's what we've been looking for. The problem, we didn't want a high labor component business, but the problem with the self-serve is we were limited in the amount of volume we could do. So therefore you had to be very careful about your real estate selection. This concept allowed us to wash way many more cars, and therefore allowed us to buy much higher value real estate in the process. So we looked at it, we walked out of the meeting, and Chip said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, first thing I think is that we're selling our self-serve, because if anybody builds against us, it's going to put us out of business, because it is a better mousetrap, number one. Number two, there's not a single one of these in all of Atlanta. And we've got, at that time, I don't know, 6 million people or so." I said, "So I don't think we have to be that good to be successful if we're the only game in town." So I said, "I'm putting in my resignation tomorrow, and I want to go do this full time." And Chip said, "I agree." And so that's kind of how I got started.
that's super cool. And so the guy in Louisiana, you just came through that relationship that was from one of the people in the self-service. That's just super interesting to think, hey, you never make that trip out to Louisiana, like would we be sitting here today? Would this be a different Gary? So kind of
Well,
crazy to
yeah, again, fate has so many twists and turns and happenstance kind of, dictates the course of your life, you're right, as you make decisions or make that extra phone call or make that trip or visit. It was so fortunate because the car wash business, when we first got into the car wash business, if you owned more than 2 or 3 locations, you were a major player. I mean, for years, if you owned 5 locations or more, you were a top 50 operator, probably up until 7 or 8 years ago. And so most people operate in their market, and the industry is just filled with the most down-to-earth, gracious people. And it was mostly a kind of a cottage industry, a lifestyle business, but people who were really good at it. Like I said, this guy in Louisiana, he made friends with a guy who was an operator in Germany. And he went over to see his washes in Germany and came back with this idea of offering free vacuum after the wash, which was, everybody said, "You're crazy. You're buying this expensive piece of property. You're putting 60 or 70% of the real estate into vacuum areas that you're not charged. This is the craziest thing we've ever seen." But he was convicted because he had gone to see it, in operation, and because somebody else had taken a chance before him. But anyway, this guy's a prince of a guy. And like a lot of people in the industry, they're like, "Yeah, we'll be happy to share anything with you. Come if you want and take pictures, and we'll explain it and ask questions." And we happened to luck into an industry that was still a cottage industry. It's changing a lot now. It's a lot more capital has come in. It's a lot more corporate in a lot of ways. But at the time, everybody was a regional competitor. And, as long as you didn't kind of poke them in the eye from a competitive standpoint, they would be more than welcoming to bring you in and teach you everything they know. And that led me to get involved in the association and just realize, you got to be a real student of this game, because you're not going to really come up with a great idea on your own per se. A lot of times it's just going around and doing the hard scrabble work of visiting a lot of sites and learning what best practices look like, and try to cobble together the best ideas you can and use it in your own business.
That's really awesome. Just the down to earth people, being a good person. People want to do business with, people they like. Obviously, reputation's everything. So would love to kind of also hear, it's 2002, early 2003, kind of like, what did that look like? Like if I were to drop in on Mammoth Holdings, like a random Tuesday, what kind of were you doing? What was Chip's doing? Like you're still learning a business model, building real estate, dealing with the car wash and any of the fire fests that, come with it.
Yeah.
So yeah, would love
Well,
some
I
insight
guess a
there.
couple things. One is, in hindsight, I look back, Chip and I wouldn't dream of being in business without him as my partner. The flip side of that, though, is we're very similar in terms of we're both financially oriented. So when we were looking at this business, we absolutely had the business model nailed from a financial standpoint, right? We studied it, we had it locked down, and subsequently we built this new model. We were right on our projections of what we thought it could do and all. So we had that cornered.
And that's a
Probably
subscription model, right?
no, not at that time. Not at that
Not at
time.
that time.
That came much later.
Okay.
But we had never built anything. Neither one of us were the best at operations.
Hmm.
Chip took more marketing classes. He also has an MBA from Georgia. So he kind of had a marketing minor. So he had a little bit more of that than I did. But we were too similar in some ways and not complementary enough. And I look back now, I still want Chip as my partner. We should have probably brought in some people who complemented us instead of us doing it ourselves, but it worked out. But once we decided to do it, we were like, okay, these are capital intensive. We've got some capital that we want to put in the business, but we're not willing to put more than that in the business. So we was like, let's go find an investor. So, the one thing we could do is put together a slide deck, and I knew how to make a pitch of what a good business looked like. So we went around and had several people willing to back us. We chose a well-known, at least in the South, family who thought it was a good idea and they wanted to back us. So we just went out and raised common equity. And then we were like, okay, I guess we built one car wash. Now we got to, keep building and learning, and, made mistakes along the way, but got that development experience and site selection experience and subsequently operating experience as we opened this model, which was very much different than self-serve. This one, we didn't have a big roster, but probably 8 to 10 per location, of which, 3 or 4 are working at any given time, but you got to, cover all the shifts because it's a 7-day-a-week operation. So we had to, hire and put in HR practices and other things. And again, we just kind of learned it as we went.
Yeah, definitely. And what was the hardest, HR operations? You guys had the slide decks done and, the finance side, but what was the hardest part for you to learn? And, you and Chip are pretty similar.
Yeah.
So yeah, would
Well,
love to hear
certainly the
that.
construction part, until you get into construction, there's just certain things you don't know. You learn them very quickly. One thing, when we raised capital, we thought we could go build 2 projects simultaneously. The bank, and it's amazing too, it's easy to get a loan when you do a personal guarantee. Sometimes the bank is like, yeah, we look at your balance sheet, your personal guarantee is worth this. And then it's almost like what are you going to do with it as an afterthought? So they gave us the money to do it, but they didn't want us to do 2 simultaneously. They want us to get one up and running and then build a second one. So that kind of delayed us a little bit. So we had a little bit more of a drag from a cash flow standpoint. So is in a lot of things, right? We didn't build in enough margin for error in terms of the amount of capital we raised. We were able to get through, but we were rubbing nickels to do that. In retrospect, I wish we'd raised a little bit more capital. And then when we started constructing our second project, we had all kind of construction delays. The weather turned bad, and we learned valuable lessons about your contractor, who their subs are, how many projects they can take on. And we were not dealing with large construction companies. We were basically what I call pickup truck contractors who could build 3 or 4 projects a year and do a really good job, but all of a sudden they do a good job, they get more business coming in, so they accept those jobs, and next thing you know, they don't have enough subs to go around, and they get themselves in trouble. So, we got very much schooled very quickly in the construction business and things to look for and what all can go wrong. And then, the value of doing borings and soil tests and all of that to make sure you got good dirt that can compact and you can build on, because you learn all of a sudden what bad dirt looks like. And I don't know, I could go on and on and on about getting a PhD in construction. Not that we're at that point, but still, it was very fun to learn things about construction that you would have never known if you hadn't just jumped in and tried to build something.
Yeah, it's great considering the similar lesson you're talking about when you were doing your co-op, where, hey, you got an A in financial accounting or whatever the accounting class was, but you had this problem and you actually don't know it. So I think truly, one of the best things is to learn by doing.
Yeah.
Otherwise, how else are you gonna figure it out? So yeah, that's super interesting, and would love to kind of hear like just at what point did you realize, Mammoth Holdings could be a true multi-state platform and not just, 2, 3, 4 car washes in the greater Atlanta area?
Well, I think a couple things along the way. After we got started 3 or 4 years in, we actually made an acquisition of some washes down in Mobile, Alabama, just an opportunity. And we looked at it and said, you know what, if we're going to ever be considered investable, we've got to prove that we can operate outside of one single market. And we've got to prove that the concept, just a basic premise that I knew from my days working with retail and restaurant clients and all of that, right, is that you got to show that the concept travels and that you've got the ability to manage it from afar. So we thought that would be a good test case, and that worked out really well. When we first got into business, I told you there was not a single one in Atlanta. Little did we know that we were only probably 2 or 3 months ahead of a lot of other people who were also being called about going to Louisiana to visit this wash, because guess what? The person who turned us on to it sold equipment. And so he told a lot of his other clients about it. And all of a sudden, Atlanta became ground zero for the development of this concept. So, at the time when we first built this, Atlanta was in a drought, pretty notorious drought. But, the good news is people wash their cars all the time because it wasn't raining very much. And then after we built the second one and other people started building in succession, kind of right around us and everything else, all of a sudden there was an explosion of car washes in a single market. And the weather turned bad because we went from a drought to rain conditions, and the economy fell apart in '08. And to put in perspective, we think that the ending of the drought and moving into a rainy season cost us probably 2 full months worth of business for several years. That was the impact of rain. We went from, let's call it 300 plus good days of weather to wash cars to 240 days. And that was a big impact, more so even than the economy. But you put all three of those together, and it was kind of a perfect storm. And we went from, gosh, we're being very successful. We're growing this. This looks great, to, I remember one November, a banker called me. This was after the collapse in '08. I think it was November of '09. He said, hey, I'm just checking in to get a sense of how the business is doing. And I looked at him, I said, it's rained 23 days out of 30 in November. I have no idea how the economy is doing, because you know what? We have zero demand. So what do you do when it rains every single day? I can't tell if the customer is okay with spend money on car washing, but I know one thing: they're not going to wash the car right now because it's raining every single day. And that, to get to the punch line on that, is that it was out of desperation that we're like, this is not working well. And we had tried In '07, we had tried a subscription model, but we didn't understand our customer base and we couldn't make it work. We would have some subscribing customers, but not nearly as much as we wanted and thought we could have. And so, I mean, it was literally Chip and I were wondering whether we had to quit the business, go back and try to be investment bankers again, which is really hard after you've been out of the business for 10 years to think
Hmm.
about getting back in. But we're like, this might not end very well for us because there are these things outside of our control. But it was in that we finally stumbled across some data that we didn't know existed. And once we got that, we started understanding our customer frequency. And then the light bulb came on. We were kind of the first in the country, not necessarily to do subscriptions, but to figure out the right pricing mechanism of it. And once we understood customer frequency, we realized that we were charging way, way too much for the subscription model. And that's why we didn't have nearly the subscribers we want. So we drastically changed our pricing. And at that point, the business blew up and exploded. And just to give you an anecdote, before the subscription model, when we built a car wash, we had to wash 7,000 cars a month to break even. So you can imagine going to a banker and saying, hey, we got this great concept and all we got to do is wash 7,000 cars, and everything above that, we start making money. And the banker's looking at you like, you got to wash 250 cars a day no matter what before you're profitable. And we're like, yeah, but and we were washing, once we started doing it, 10, 12, 15,000 cars a month. But we still had that every beginning of every month, that 7,000 car bogey to hit break even. And we, start the month, you tell me we had no idea what the weather was going to do. By the time we fully integrated the subscription model, we were able to take our paid break even from 7,000 cars a month to zero. So we had enough subscribers because our business model is very high fixed cost, very low marginal cost. And once we filled up that capacity with these members and a certain level, it covered all of our operating costs, whether we washed a single paid car or not. And that all of a sudden took weather out of the equation because our problem was we just had an unpredictable model. We'd be very profitable, but in any given quarter, you tell me, I say, oh, we're going to be up or down based on how the weather is this quarter versus last quarter. We wouldn't even measure we would have our numbers, but we wouldn't even compare our business on a monthly basis because it was so volatile. We could only measure it kind of on a quarter over quarter basis because you then get some sort of averaging in place. But then once we knew that all of a sudden we're not going to have any bad months anymore because we're covering all of our operating costs, that's when I knew we had an investable model.
Awesome.
The Express model made it scalable where we could build multiple units in multiple markets, but it still wasn't investable until the subscription model really came into play.
Awesome. That's super cool. Subscription model takes off. Mammoth as a whole has done, more than 32 acquisitions. You've developed over 40 new sites. Would love to hear kind of like what you learned about integrating acquired businesses, especially, in Louisiana, in Atlanta, in Alabama. Yes, they are regional, but, different customers and different owner operators into a larger platform like yourself.
Yeah. Well, a couple things. One is we saw early on that professional capital was really starting to flow into this business. And once word got out of the subscription business, the professional investor class reared their head and we could see what was going to happen. So again, fortunately, Chip and I, with our backgrounds, we knew who all these players were. And Mr. Car Wash, who's the largest out there, was owned by a small private equity firm out of Canada. And then they sold to Leonard Green. And Leonard Green was a 800-pound gorilla especially in the consumer retail space. And then another company came over from Europe, bought some sites, and then they were bought by Rourke Capital, who was the second 800-pound gorilla. So we're like, okay, now, even though we've got a dozen sites, if we're not careful, we're going to get run over by this capital. But we also knew that surprisingly, there's elements of car washing that are quite simple, but there are some devilish details that make it very, very difficult to operate beyond what the professional investor can see and understand. So because of that, we said, we'd like to have a separate or a differentiated approach to how we do this. And because I'd been involved in the industry for a long time, we do have a international association. I was the president of that for a couple of years. But because we'd gone around the country and around the world visiting car washes, we just have a lot of relationships. And I said, I think a lot of guys are like in the same boat we are. They've built a business. Sometimes they're second or third generation in this. They're trying to figure out what's going on. They're getting close to retirement age, but they love the industry and they don't walk around. They don't want to leave it. And so I think we can come up with a differentiated concept where we acquire operators that we know, they're very well vetted, and then they roll equity in and they help us run the business. We do change their role. They're not involved in the day-to-day as much. We do kind of bring things under one umbrella from an operating philosophy, a back office standpoint, but we actually have true operators in the field. Whereas in the past, a lot of these roll-ups that were getting done, they would buy it out from an owner. He had 5 or 6 locations, really wasn't any kind of middle management existed in the industry. So financial buyers would buy them, the owner would leave, usually go out and start a competing business, and these stores would get run into the ground. So we kind of had a really good reception from that standpoint. And we looked and found other operators who we thought would be good partners because we'd known them for a long time. And we found some that were just really complementary to what we were doing. I mean, Chip and I had the financial part down, but we looked at some really good operators, systems, processes, things that we knew we had to have in place to really scale the business and take it to the next level and beyond, QuickBooks accounting and all the things that you typically find with, operators that own, a handful of car washes.
Awesome. That's great. And I guess like what were you looking for? Obviously, you were involved with, the car wash association, probably knew everyone in the industry, but like what were you guys looking for in a partner? Obviously, you have to like them, you have to do business with them, but you want them to be complementary to you and Chip.
hmm
But, like how do you think about that for, partners because you want to go underneath the Mammoth Holdings company
Yeah,
structure?
it's interesting because I'll kind of relate this back to what we talked about a few minutes ago. But most of these are like single owner operators, right? Some of them had partners, but most of them were just single operators. I tried to pull in what I learned from my days at JC Bradford about what a good partnership looks like.
Mm.
And I said, so our number one rule that we put in place was no jerks allowed. Bad partners are a disaster. So make sure you really vet. And some acquisitions we didn't make, even though we're close friends with the partner, but we didn't want them. We knew though that they would be difficult to work with, even though we liked them immensely. But we kind of had behavioral profiles, psychological profiles of what would make for a good partner. So we were very cautious and determinative in assessing some of these acquisitions. So that was a large part of it. And then because we knew the operating levers in the business, I think, as well as anybody from a financial standpoint, even though we were looking at really well-run operations, we could typically identify, we know that most people did not understand the subscription model as well as we did. So we saw a huge opportunity to go in and refine that playbook and drive the top line. And at the same time, in the car wash business, the operating margins are stupid silly at scale. If you get volumes up, the margins are so big that a lot of operators, they were just happy with the money they're making, and they really didn't dial in the expense side of the business as carefully as they could. So, the thing I'm most proud of is we bought some really good operators in all these acquisitions we did, but everyone we bought, we improved performance post-acquisition. And these were not broken companies. In some cases, they were better operators than we were, but we put in a playbook and we identified the things that would move the needle. And so we were able to, in a lot of cases, we would have months after acquisition where the flow through of profitability, that incremental revenue that came in, the flow through of profitability was oftentimes greater than 100%. So we were getting top line growth and expense reduction. And boy, that's when it's really fun and you start really creating a ton of value when you can start driving that.
Awesome. And super cool as well, having the owner operators of the prior, the ones you just bought aligning them by having them buy in, and have some skin in the game with you guys as well. Just, wanting to improve and, grow their business, and awesome, that they got to be a part of something like, Mammoth as well. So
Yeah. Yeah.
super, super interesting. So would love kind of what do you think Mammoth did, differently operationally that really mattered? Once you were, past 50, past 75, past 100 locations, that really mattered to, these other competitors.
Well, clearly, I think two things we looked at. One was clearly we had to get better at putting in scalable systems. So, we got up to school very fast on ERP systems and technology and other things that we needed to put in place to scale. And I think along the line, we also realized that that's a never ending process. What you need to scale at 30 units is not what you need at 50 units, which is not what you need at 100 units. But you can't necessarily, when you're at 25 units, you can't go build an infrastructure for 500 units without breaking the bank. So you learn very quickly that it's going to be an iterative process of here's what we need now is going to take us to this level, and then we're going to have to invest and scale beyond that. And the second thing is, I think with the guys that joined us, we just said, let's have very clearly defined roles and responsibilities. We tried to take things off of their plate that they didn't like who likes HR related stuff, and we could take a lot of that, which they were glad to get rid of. And then some of them, we had to have honest conversations and say, look, you got to let your people step in. We got to create, and I said before, there is no middle management in this industry. So we had to go create middle management. And I said, every car wash operator out there that we bought was a glorified regional manager, because you typically have 3, 5, 8 car washes. So you're a regional manager. We need you to step out of that. We need to grow these regional managers who can do this when you're no longer around. And we don't need you there on a Saturday morning trying to fix something that's broken. We've got to really figure out how to operate on our own two legs. I need you there to keep it out of the ditch, keep your eyes on things, but I can't have you running the day-to-day operations and us get to where we want to be from a scale standpoint.
Awesome. That's super insightful there. Cool. So another topic I kind of wanted to hit on as well. So in 2018, I believe, you had a equity capital raise with Red Dog Equity and the Pritzker organization. So would love to kind of hear, what you were thinking about there, kind of where you were in your stage as a company. Obviously, you had grown immensely, but kind of like what were you thinking about there?
Yeah, that kind of dovetails back. And when I said when we saw capital coming into the industry, we had a dozen locations in 2018. So we're like, okay, it's going to get real, but either we have to sell out, or if we're going to stay in this, we got to get serious and we're going to need some capital. So we were able to go out and find the private equity group. We really didn't want to be part of an institutional round with some large, and we were putting all this together. So there were a lot of equity groups that were like, we don't understand this. You're trying to do a roll up and you really haven't done it much yet. So there's a lot of execution risk and all, but we were able to get some people interested that we knew what we were doing or had a good shot at it. But specifically though, we didn't really want to be part of a fund that we knew had a 3-year life, that, what they did with our investment was kind of predicated on how the other investments in the fund were doing. So we thought kind of a family office type ownership model made a lot more sense. Not that anything is permanent and forever, but we wanted, the potential for long-term patient capital. And that's where the Pritzker organization came in. And they've been really good partners and very patient. And, they look at building a business over the long term. And, for their standpoint, they're like, as long as it's working, we're happy to own it indefinitely. But they do buy and sell things. They sell things occasionally, but they're also happy to own long term. So we wanted somebody who understood what we were doing, and that it was going to be a multi-year process, and that the business is volatile, it's up and down. So we need somebody who understands and digs into that and understand where the industry is going.
Yeah, no, that's super insightful, especially since, I feel like you see a lot of these private equity companies now, doing roll-ups in the HVAC space and whatnot. And hey, is it a 5-year hold period, 3-year hold period? And like, some of these business owners you probably were familiar with. They probably didn't know anything besides running the day-to-day of their operation. So great that you found,
Yeah.
a fantastic
Well,
partner
the
like
thing
yourself.
I mentioned this is that from the outside looking in, from an investor standpoint, the problem that I see that a lot of investors had with this industry is it checks all the boxes that you want from what a good business model looks like. It's very high margin, it's a affordable luxury. There's no receivables risk, no inventory risk compared to other consumer facing industries like retail, restaurants, or whatever. You look at it, you're like, oh my gosh, here's a business with a 50% plus operating margin and you can run it with 3 or 4 people. How great is this? The problem is that I look at it totally different. I was like, people think car washing is a retail business. It's not a retail business. It's a manufacturing business, a production facility. And I look at everything we do as mini production facilities. We have our own water treatment plant at each individual car wash, and we've got moving parts that are so complicated in some ways compared to, if you run a restaurant, if the fryer goes down, you can get that replaced or fixed pretty easily. In the car wash space, things are constantly breaking. You got hydraulics, you got electric motors, all kind of things that you would find in an industrial production facility, and keeping that running at a high level is very, very difficult. So if you don't have the mentality of saying, we've got capacity utilization that we've got to fill it up, we've got to run at very high volumes, and we got to make sure we're putting out a consistent product, those things don't happen by accident. And so everybody who came in the industry was saying, oh, all we got to do is hire some young kids, and we've got to be nice to customers, and we've got to offer certain amenities. And they're focused on everything except the real key components of what makes the business successful. And a lot of times I do some training classes with our people. I bring up the example of Chick-fil-A. I use that, and everybody wants to be like a Chick-fil-A. But I posit the thesis that says, tell me what you like about Chick-fil-A. And everybody will repeat back, I like the food, or I like how polite they are. I like the uniforms and the hustle and all these things. And I was like, that's all great. And those things are true. But the thing they do better than anybody else is they get you on and off their property faster than anybody. And it's no surprise why they do 3 times the volume of a typical McDonald's, 6 days a week instead of 7. But it's because they're maniacal about their execution through the drive-through. And I was like, if it took them 25 minutes to get you a chicken sandwich, none of those other things that you just mentioned would matter. It's that number one thing that allows all these other little things to add up and be icing on the cake. But the cake is the fact that they can process orders better than anybody else in the industry. They just built a store outside of Atlanta with 4 drive-through lanes, and they process 750 orders an hour. They can process a meal every 6 seconds. But there was a Wall Street Journal article that talks about that. So we teach, for us as operators, we're like, look, don't go to the competition down the road and use that as a comparison. We want to introduce you to the best operators in our industry, and we want to introduce you to other concepts outside of our industry. Those are the things that we strive to do and be like, to really be a cut above from an operational standpoint, and look at the business as a production facility, not a consumer facing retail business.
Awesome. Appreciate that insight there. Would love kind of now interested in, so you were CEO for, nearly 20 years before stepping back in 2022. What kind of made you feel like the timing was right? Obviously, you started, you, Chip, your partner, a couple other people, grew to about 1,500 employees. Like what kind of made you think the time was right to step back?
Well, funny story, when the Pritzker organization was looking at us, they fully, but I think wisely, asked a good question, and that is, because we were talking about doing this roll up and on. They said, "Well, look, you've got a nice little business with a dozen units, but what makes you think that you're going to really be successful at running something at 100, 200, 300 units?" And my honest answer, I was like, you know what? There's no evidence at all that we'll be successful doing this because we've never done it before. I said, but, and I think they were hinting at, hey, if we get in this and you and Chip aren't up to the task, how hard are you going to make it on us to bring in people to really run this thing? And so I think my answer really helped them feel comfortable because my direct response is, A, there's no evidence that we can do this. We're going to give it our best effort. If we're not capable, hopefully we will be smart enough to step aside. But if we're not, please fire us and protect our equity because we're rolling over a big chunk of our equity back into this business. I think they got very comfortable. And I said, look, guys, I think I can get us to 100 plus units. I think that'll be a lot of fun. I said, quite frankly, once we get to a bigger number and we're trying to scale the business, as we become more corporate as a business, I'm going to become less interested because that means more meetings, more things, the things that I don't have an interest in doing. So I said, let's get this thing going on the right trajectory. And then at the appropriate time, let's try to pull in more of a professional management team that has experience in scaling businesses. Quite frankly, people who like working in that type of organization where they don't mind the incessant meetings and the decisions and all those things. I'm like, I can find other things to do and I can be an ambassador and I can stay involved in the industry and do all the things that I like to do. But if I never have to talk about implementing another ERP system, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, that's great there. Was it like emotionally hard, just being like, hey, here's the next step, or is
You
just
know,
like,
I
hey, it's the right time?
It's interesting. There's some people, some dear friends of mine who, like I said, some are second and third generation in the car wash business. So they eat,
Yeah.
sleep, and breathe washing cars. I always thought of it. We never had children involved in the business. And so I looked at it as like, it's a business. I mean, I enjoy it. It's great. I love the people in it. It's very satisfying. But I was never wed to the business to say, they're going to have to take me out on a stretcher. Just wanted to make the business as successful as possible. And I'm happy to be involved and I kind of know what I'm good at, but I also know what I'm not good at. And I don't need to be caught up in titles or anything else. And look, I mean, when you get in this business, it's 6 or 7 days a week. And I was doing it for 20 years. So at some point you're like, I'm a little tired. And it's okay to say, look, we've got this on the right trajectory. I can play a different role, and being the CEO does not necessarily mean that that needs to happen for us to be successful and get it to the next level. So now, once you do step down and the phone stops ringing and other stuff, I've had to, you wrestle with what does retirement look like. And I knew kind of going into it, I was like, I'm not going to fully retire. I was too young at the time, and I said I got too much stuff in front of me that I want to do. But I was thoughtful enough to know instead of the one thing that I spent all of my waking moments on, I divided it up into 4 or 5 different things that I wanted to spend time on, of which this is one. But then I have these other things that I'm invested in as well and interested in doing. It kind of, it's just a new chapter and a different way to look at it.
Yeah, definitely. And so now you're kind of chairman and advisor for Mammoth Holdings. Like, how do you see your role as, not overstepping, but someone who did found it, definitely has a good 2 cents on some advice for the CEO right now.
Well, our first team that we brought on didn't really work out. And I was kind of shocked because, I knew going in that I needed to step aside. I didn't want to be that guy, that guy that won't ever leave. And so very respectful. And I think very, very much said, look, this is yours to run. I'm here to be a resource. But quite honestly, I was shocked at how quickly I was kind of shut out of the business. And it was a valuable lesson to learn that people who come in, who are the corporate types, who have done these things on paper to help scale a business, but didn't necessarily ever have an entrepreneurial spirit. And as one of my partners said, they're the person who signs the back of the check instead of the front of the check. Now, I don't know, Jack, your age now, not many people write checks anymore, but, the analogy is not lost on me. But it was interesting how it's almost as if they didn't believe that we wanted them to be successful. and that we wanted to contribute, but only to help them, not to second guess them or anything like that. So that was been really kind of an interesting dilemma to watch these transitions. And a lot of times when you have a non-entrepreneurial type leader come in, and they're good news is they're used to the bureaucracy, they're used to scaling businesses and all these other things. But in some ways, I would argue the hubris and the ego, they almost look at it like, well, but I worked in a large company, I've got this title, I've got this prestige, you guys are running car washes. And finally, one of them, I pulled aside. I said, you realize that all these people that we bought who rolled in equity, that most of them can buy you multiple times over, even though you've been highly successful in a corporate world. These are small business guys, but they've paid tens and tens of millions of dollars and have been very successful. So don't look down on small business owners and just assume because they didn't have a high title or work in a prestigious business or name firm of some sort that they're not really savvy, smart business people who can help you if you have the right attitude and just ask for the help. But anyway, you know,
Yeah.
valuable lesson. And that's the one thing I've learned. You never stop learning. And, there's always a new something to learn, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think that's super, super insightful. And I know we talked a little bit about this, kind of this reputation you have, this, hey, you did investment banking, you did this, oh, you're just a business owner. Like, what do you know? So I just think, just having humility and, n nothing's below me. We're all just human at the end of the day as well. So I guess I'll kind of like wrapping up a little bit now. Like I know you're involved in Nurture Capital Partners. You're on the board of Georgia Tech. You help out with Vanderbilt's Owen School of Management and the International Car Wash Association. And obviously Mammoth as well. Like, how do you decide where to spend your time and energy now?
Well, I need to do a little bit better job of saying no to certain things, but I feel as busy now as I was when I was full time with Mammoth. Again, it's just kind of broken up into different tranches, so to speak, as opposed to the one thing. But I do some charitable work because I have two children with disabilities, and so I'm very interested in the long-term housing needs, as a lot of these children that got diagnosed with autism, two of my children were diagnosed in the 90s, and so they're now in their 30s. And back then, autism was fairly rare. Now it's so predominant, and so many kids are affected. And the school system will take on responsibility until they're 22 years of age, but usually when they hit 22, everything stops, education stops, and eventually parents are like, what's going to happen to my child when I get older and can no longer take care of them? So I think there's going to be a really interesting, there's already a huge need. It's going to get greater, but I think there's some interesting business models that can be created around providing housing, long-term housing for people with developmental disabilities. It's very challenging, but it's going to be a demographic wave that's coming. So anyway, I want to be involved in that to help give back, to kind of honor my children and help other families that are really struggling. They don't have the resources or even know where to start in terms of solving that problem. So that's one area. Getting involved in tech and Vanderbilt is a chance for me to give back, but I really enjoyed being around the students. I learned quickly when you step down as CEO and your phone stops ringing, if you're not careful, you become irrelevant very, very fast. And that's okay for some people. They're like, yeah, I'm fine to step out of it. I don't care if my phone ever rings again. But I'm just kind of a lifelong learner. And so I said, this is a chance for me to kind of not only give back, but I get a lot of good intel and information and learning just from being around the colleges and what all's going on and getting introduced to people. It's phenomenal. And then I do some investment work. I'm on some boards, invest in certain companies, not huge, but if there's something I like, I'll invest in it and sometimes take a board seat. I'm developing a farm. It's just something fun to work on, and
Yeah.
kind of scratches the itch of development work and building something. So anyway, with all those things, there's, I fill up my day. I don't
Yeah.
really and I like to play golf. So, but I play more golf than I used to, but I'm not a 6 or 7 day a week kind of golf guy. My back wouldn't hold up anyway. So, one or two rounds of golf a week is fine. But, I have a little more downtime than I used to have.
Awesome. No, really appreciate that. So, got two more questions. So, one of my last ones is, when you look back, over, more than 2 decades with Mammoth, you know, you've built a beautiful business, supported, you know, thousands of people's, livelihoods. What are you most proud of?
I think the thing, well, providing jobs for people. Somebody gave me a great saying, and they said, as an entrepreneur, you will look up one day and you will look at the people who joined you early on, who were loyal, they believed in you, and you'll shake your head saying, oh my gosh, they were idiots for placing their trust in me. Little did they know what they were getting themselves into. But no, it is more fulfilling than anything else, is knowing that you're creating jobs and opportunity for people. And especially in our business, we have a largely uneducated workforce. I mean, we do have some college grads, and I'm all for higher education, but I'm really proud that we have people in their 20s who are managing a $10 million facility of a car wash, and they're making six figures and providing for their family, and they're not in debt. And, there really is a path. It's kind of the micro blue collar, journey, so to speak. But I'm really excited about providing opportunities for people and stuff like that. And I think the second thing, I look back and say, even though you don't really want to go through it again, but you're very thankful for the times when the business struggled and almost failed, because had we not gone through a lot of adversity, we would have never been forced to sit down and rethink the model and figure out the subscription business, which ended up being the best thing that ever happened to us. But it wasn't until we were literally had our backs against the wall thinking that we weren't going to be able to sustain the business and lose it all. So, if success comes easy and it's a 45-degree slope up and to the right, I'm sure it's rewarding, but it's not as satisfying. And to me, and that's why I wanted to talk today, to say, look, there's plenty of failures, there's plenty of doubt, there's plenty of sleepless nights, there's plenty of struggles, and we did a lot of things wrong, and yet it still worked out. But it's the struggle and the process more so than what appears now from the outside looking in to be, oh wow, this is a successful company. Really understanding the difficulties and the stupid things we did, and the struggle along the way is really the kind of the story that I hope people walk away with if they're aspiring to be an entrepreneur, and or they already are and they're struggling in some of the businesses they have. That's the valuable takeaway for me.
Awesome. Really appreciate that. And I feel like learning from, failure and hey, we're about to go unders the best way for anyone to learn. Last question here, and I stole this from, How I Built This, one of my favorite podcasts is one of
Yeah.
my favorite podcasts, and kind of why I decided to do this was, like, you know, 20 years of building Mammoth, how much do you think it was just from hard work and, how much of this do you contribute to success? Um,
Well, I think there's equal parts. There's a good part of luck, right? But luck is truly a part of anything, but it's certainly not everything. So I think for Chip and I, especially, we were prepared. I mean, not for everything, but we were very studious and we were very thoughtful, and we were making sure that we did understand the business and the economics and all that. And so a lot of our previous lives was well served in, making this successful, and it led to that. And then the third part is, every time it's just having the attitude that failure is not an option. And I told myself every time that just something bad would happen, invariably something bad would happen, whether it was HR related problem or a construction problem or just business or weather, whatever it was. When you have a setback, I just always told myself, I said, well, I guess you don't have any other choice than to redouble your efforts, right? It's like,
Mhm.
if it failed, if it didn't work, it's because you're not working hard enough. And I know, there's a lot of stuff about working smart and all that stuff, but I'm just talking about you've got to be able to really enjoy the grind, or if not enjoy it, at least be willing to do it. And when you get knocked down, you just have to say, you know what? I only have one option. I got to work harder. I got to really double down and just keep at it and never let up. And then once you start hitting success, I listen to a lot of, it's interesting. I'm very fascinated with some of the philosophies and coaching and all that comes out of Nick Saban. And you listen to him and some of his wisdom that he puts out there. And his whole point too is like, if you ever think you've made it and you've got success, you're just right on the edge of being knocked down, and you're going to start going backwards because, I'm just have the mentality too. It's like so many people rest on their laurels, people who they did something 20 years ago and they're living in that moment and claiming success. I mean, to me, it's like yesterday's gone. Whatever you accomplished up until that point, that's great, but that's no assurance that it's going to last or you're going to be relevant or be able to hang on to it. You got to get up hungry every day. And the more successful you are, sometimes it's easy to lose that hunger, but it takes a lot of discipline to be able to say, yeah, I don't have to do that today. I don't really feel like doing it, but still saying, you know what? No, don't ever think that you're too good to all of a sudden stop doing the things that made you successful, and understand that you're going to still be doing that until you finally do hang it up one day. And when you fully retire and are able to do that, you'll get to that point. But I don't see that in my cards anytime soon. I got to grind. I mean, it's just what I do.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Gary, thanks again for taking the time and for being the first guest on the making of. I really appreciate it, and thanks so much for your insights.
Well, I hope this is going to be a Wikipedia entry one day about who was the first guest on. So I look forward to that, and I hope whoever had a chance to listen to this, hopefully it was they'll get a nugget or two out of here that'll be beneficial for them. And I appreciate the time you've given me.
Yep. Thanks so much, Gary. Have a great one.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Making of. Huge thanks again to Gary Dennis for sharing his story, going from a humble background to Wall Street to building Mammoth Holdings into a multi-state platform. This is my first podcast, and if you've enjoyed this conversation, please follow on whatever platform you're listening to, leave a quick rating, and share it with a friend who's thinking about entrepreneurship or just wants to hear a really cool story. I'm Jack Pitts. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next episode. Thank you.